The family gathering should have been filled with warmth and laughter, but the air was thick with tension. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, surrounded by faces that once looked at him with respect. Now, those same faces held nothing but contempt. His daughter Sarah, 28 and coldly beautiful, stood up slowly. Her designer dress caught the chandelier light as she turned to face him directly. The room fell silent, even the children sensing something momentous was about to happen. "Dad," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Let's be honest about something. You have nothing left to offer this family." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Gasps echoed around the room, but not from shock at her cruelty. Rather from surprise that someone had finally said what they'd all been thinking. His wife Margaret's lips curved into the faintest smirk, while his mother-in-law Eleanor nodded approvingly from her chair. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up in his defense. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his coffee cup, the betrayal cutting deeper than any business failure ever could. Sarah wasn't finished. She paced around the table like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, her heels clicking against the marble floor with each deliberate step. "Let me paint the picture for everyone," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "No money. His company went bankrupt 3 years ago. No career, nobody will hire a 62-year-old has-been. No influence. His former friends won't even return his calls." Uncle Thomas nodded gravely from across the table. Cousin Patricia whispered something to her husband, who chuckled quietly. The children had been ushered away, but the adults remained, witnessing what felt like a public execution. "He sits in this house, Mom's house, by the way, pretending he still matters. Pretending he's the man who once provided for us." Sarah's eyes were bright with a cruel satisfaction. "But that man is gone. What's left is just this." She gestured dismissively at her father, who sat frozen in his chair. Richard wanted to speak, to defend himself, to remind them of everything he'd sacrificed for this family. But the words wouldn't come. Margaret reached over and patted his hand mockingly. "Sarah's just being honest, dear," she said sweetly. "We all know it's true." Just as the silence threatened to suffocate Richard completely, the doorbell rang. Margaret frowned. They weren't expecting anyone else. The housekeeper's footsteps echoed through the foyer, followed by muffled conversation. Moments later, a distinguished man in an expensive suit appeared in the doorway. He carried a leather briefcase and wore the serious expression of someone accustomed to dealing with significant matters. "Mr. Harrison," the man said, nodding respectfully to Richard. "I apologize for the interruption, but you did request that I come today." The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Eleanor's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Margaret's smirk faded as she tried to place the stranger. Sarah stopped pacing, suddenly uncertain. "Who is this?" Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp with authority she was used to wielding in this house. Richard slowly stood up, and for the first time that evening, he met his daughter's eyes directly. "This is Mr. James Blackwood, my attorney." The family exchanged confused glances. Richard hadn't mentioned hiring a lawyer, certainly not one who looked this expensive. Blackwood's suit alone probably cost more than most people made in a month. "Your attorney?" Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "What on earth do you need an attorney for? You don't have anything left to." She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Before Mr. Blackwood could open his briefcase, Eleanor's cane struck the floor with authority. "Now wait just a minute," she snapped, her aged voice carrying the imperious tone she'd perfected over decades of controlling her family. "I don't know what kind of desperate theatrics this is supposed to be, but—" "Grandmother's right," Sarah interrupted, crossing her arms. "This is pathetic, Dad. Are you seriously trying to create some kind of dramatic moment? What's next? Are you going to claim you've been hiding millions under your mattress?" Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Uncle Thomas shook his head sympathetically, as if watching a man's final, pitiful attempt at relevance. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her confidence returning. "Richard, honey, whatever this little performance is supposed to accomplish, It's not going to change the facts. You have nothing. We all know it. You know it. Mr. Blackwood stood quietly by the doorway, his expression professionally neutral. He'd seen family dynamics like this before. Wealth and power stripped away, leaving only bitter truths and wounded pride. He's clinging to his old pride, Eleanor declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. Can't accept that his time is over. Nothing he owns matters anymore because he doesn't own anything. The lawyer's briefcase remained closed, but something in his stillness suggested he was waiting for exactly the right moment. 3 years earlier, Richard stared at the bankruptcy papers spread across his desk, the weight of failure crushing down on him. Harrison Industries, the company he'd built from nothing over 30 years, was finished. But it hadn't been market forces that destroyed him, it had been sabotage from within. Eleanor had convinced Margaret to join the company's board, bringing her business school-educated brothers with her. Slowly, systematically, they'd undermined every decision Richard made. "We're just looking out for the family's interests," Margaret had said when Richard confronted her about the hostile takeover brewing in his own boardroom. "You're too emotional about this company. We need fresh perspective." The fresh perspective had driven Harrison Industries into the ground within 18 months. Contracts mysteriously fell through. Key employees left for competitors. Loans were called in early. Richard had watched helplessly as everything he'd built crumbled, engineered by the very people he'd trusted most. The final blow came when Eleanor's lawyers found a way to seize the company's remaining assets, claiming Richard had mismanaged funds. He'd lost everything, or so they thought. What they didn't know was that Richard had seen the betrayal coming long before they'd made their final move, and he'd been preparing. Back to the present. Richard's eyes found Sarah's face across the room, remembering the exact moment he'd lost her forever. It wasn't when the company failed. It wasn't even when the money ran out. It was 6 months ago, in this very room, when Eleanor had laid out her final ultimatum. "Sarah, darling," the old woman had said, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes calculating. "You're a smart girl. You can see which way the wind is blowing. Your father is a broken man, and broken men drag everyone down with them." Margaret had nodded eagerly. "We're offering you a full partnership in the new family trust, sweetheart. Eleanor's been generous enough to include you in her will." But, Sarah had asked, though Richard could see she already knew what was coming. "But you can't have both," Eleanor had said simply. "You can stand with us, with the future, with financial security, or you can stand with your father and his sentimentality." Richard had watched his daughter's face carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of loyalty to the man who'd raised her, who'd worked himself to exhaustion to give her every advantage. Instead, Sarah had smiled that cold, calculating smile he'd never seen before. "That's not really a choice at all, is it?" she'd said. That night, Richard had called Mr. Blackwood and set everything in motion. Mr. Blackwood finally moved from the doorway, setting his briefcase on the polished dining table with deliberate precision. The sound echoed in the suddenly quiet room like a gavel striking wood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling significant matters. "I'm here today at Mr. Harrison's request to read certain legal documents that have come into effect as of this afternoon." He opened the briefcase with a sharp click, revealing neat stacks of papers bearing official seals and ribbon bindings. The family leaned forward unconsciously, curiosity overcoming their previous dismissiveness. "What documents?" Margaret asked, her voice higher than usual. Blackwood lifted the first folder and opened it carefully. "Mr. Harrison has asked me to inform his family of certain arrangements he's made regarding his estate and various assets that may have been overlooked in previous discussions." Sarah scoffed. "Assets? What assets? We've been over this 100 times. He has nothing left." The lawyer's eyes met hers with professional detachment. "I think you'll find that statement somewhat premature, Miss Harrison." He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers. "Shall we begin with the Cayman Islands properties?" The room went dead silent. Eleanor's cane slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. The what? Margaret whispered. Eleanor shot to her feet faster than anyone had seen her move in years. Her face flushed red with indignation. That's impossible, she shrieked, pointing a gnarled finger at the lawyer. He's lying. This is some kind of fraud. Margaret jumped up beside her mother, her carefully composed facade cracking. There are no Cayman Islands properties. We went through everything when the company failed. Every account, every asset, every asset you knew about, Blackwood corrected calmly, not looking up from his papers. This is ridiculous. Sarah's voice cracked with barely controlled panic. We checked everything. The lawyers, the accountants, the forensic investigators. Nobody found hidden assets because there weren't any. Uncle Thomas was shaking his head vigorously. This has to be some kind of scam. Richard, what are you paying this man to lie for you? Some desperate attempt to. Mr. Blackwood is a senior partner at Cromwell, Hayes and Associates, Richard said quietly, speaking for the first time since the lawyer's arrival. Perhaps you've heard of them? The name hit the room like a thunderbolt. Cromwell, Hayes and Associates was one of the most prestigious law firms in the country, specializing in high-net-worth estate planning and international asset management. Eleanor's face went white. That's impossible. They only work with people who have substantial assets to protect, Blackwood finished. Quite right. Q. 4 years earlier, before the bankruptcy. Asterisk. Richard sat across from James Blackwood in the lawyer's downtown office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling law books and expensive art. Outside the window, the city sprawled below them like a chessboard. You're certain this is necessary? Blackwood had asked, reviewing the complex documents spread between them. I've seen the writing on the wall, Richard replied, his voice heavy with the weight of impending betrayal. My wife's family has been positioning themselves to take over my company for months. They think I don't notice the late-night phone calls, the private meetings, the way they've been courting my board members. Blackwood nodded professionally. Asset protection planning is always wise, though I hope your concerns prove unfounded. They won't, Richard said with certainty. Eleanor Whitman doesn't make half moves. If she's positioning for a takeover, she's already thought 3 steps ahead. But there's one thing she hasn't considered. Which is? Richard smiled grimly. I've been thinking 4 steps ahead. Over the following months, while his family celebrated their growing influence, Richard had quietly transferred assets to offshore trusts, established foreign LLCs, and converted liquid investments into untraceable holdings. By the time Eleanor made her move against Harrison Industries, the most valuable assets were already beyond her reach, hidden in a labyrinth of legal structures that would take years to unravel. Sarah's initial shock quickly transformed into defiant anger. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, channeling the same imperious attitude that had made Eleanor Whitman feared in social circles for decades. Fine, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Let's say you're telling the truth. Let's say Dad has been hiding money from his own family for years. Her eyes locked with Richard's, cold and unforgiving. Do you know what that makes you? A liar, a cheat, a man who couldn't trust his own wife and daughter. She began pacing again, but this time her movements were sharper, more aggressive. And even if you have money, which I still don't believe, what good does it do you? You have no family left, Dad. No one who loves you. No one who cares whether you live or die. Margaret nodded eagerly, grasping at this new line of attack. She's right, Richard. Money without family is just nothing. Empty numbers in an account. Sarah stopped directly in front of her father's chair, leaning down so their faces were inches apart. What's wealth without love? She whispered, her words like venom. What's success without someone to share it with? You've spent so much time protecting your precious assets that you've lost everything that actually matters. Around the table, the family murmured agreement. Even Uncle Thomas looked relieved, as if Sarah had found the perfect counterargument to whatever revelations were coming. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat politely, drawing attention back to the documents in his hands. If I may continue, he said, The Cayman properties are just the beginning. He turned to a new page, his finger tracing down a list that seemed to go on forever. There's the Swiss account established in 2021, the Bermuda Trust funded in 2022, and the Luxembourg holding company that owns approximately $4 million in blue-chip securities. Each revelation hit the family like a physical blow. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her face ashen. Margaret's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. But the most significant asset, Blackwood continued, is the private equity stake in Morrison Technologies. Mr. Harrison purchased a 20% ownership position 18 months ago, just before they went public. Current value, approximately $15 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood frozen in place, her confident demeanor cracking like ice under pressure. "This is impossible," Margaret whispered. "We would have known. The divorce lawyers would have found it during the asset discovery. The bankruptcy court would have seized everything." Blackwood smiled slightly. "Not if the assets were never legally Mr. Harrison's to begin with. Everything I've mentioned is held in irrevocable trusts, foreign LLCs, and corporate structures that Mr. Harrison controls but doesn't technically own." He looked up from his papers. "Quite ingenious, actually." "Now," Blackwood said, reaching for a different set of documents bound in blue ribbon, "we come to Mr. Harrison's last will and testament, executed just this morning and properly witnessed." Richard watched his family's faces as the implications sank in. They'd been so focused on what he had, they hadn't considered what would happen to it when he was gone. "The will is quite straightforward," the lawyer continued. "Mr. Harrison's entire estate, including all trusts, foreign holdings, and domestic assets, will be distributed upon his death as follows." The family leaned forward unconsciously, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by desperate attention. 70% of all assets will establish the Harrison Educational Foundation, providing scholarships for underprivileged students pursuing business degrees. Blackwood's voice remained professionally neutral. 20% will be donated to various charities focused on supporting entrepreneurs who've lost their businesses due to family betrayal. Eleanor made a choking sound. Margaret's face had gone completely white. The remaining 10% will cover administrative costs and legal fees. Sarah found her voice first. What about family? What about us?" Blackwood consulted his papers again. "I see no provisions for family members in this will, with one exception, which I'll address in a moment." The room erupted in chaos, but Blackwood held up his hand. "However, there is one additional clause that requires special attention." The revelation hit the family like a demolition ball. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure shattered completely as she struggled to stand, her cane forgotten on the floor. "This is insane," she screamed, her voice cracking with age and fury. "Richard, you can't do this. We're your family. We have rights." Margaret was hyperventilating, her hands fluttering around her throat like trapped birds. 70% to strangers? "Richard, this is madness. What about our life? What about my future? I'm your wife." But it was Sarah's reaction that cut the deepest. For the first time since the reading began, her mask of cold confidence slipped entirely. Her face went pale, and her hands shook as she gripped the back of a chair for support. "Dad," she whispered, her voice small and frightened. "You can't mean this. You can't leave us with nothing after everything we've—" She stopped herself, realizing what she'd been about to say. "After everything we've been through together." But they all knew that wasn't true. After everything they'd put him through was more accurate. Uncle Thomas was frantically calculating in his head, his earlier smugness replaced by panic. Cousin Patricia had started crying silently, realizing that her expectations of inheritance had just evaporated. The room that had been filled with mock and dismissal minutes earlier now reeked of desperation and fear. Only Richard remained calm, watching the chaos with the detached interest of a man observing the natural consequences of carefully laid plans. 2 years earlier, Richard sat in his study at midnight, surrounded by legal documents that painted a picture of betrayal so complete it took his breath away. The forensic accountant he'd hired had uncovered everything. Every forged signature, every backdated contract, every carefully orchestrated financial manipulation. Eleanor had been planning the destruction of Harrison Industries for 3 years, not 3 months. She'd cultivated relationships with Richard's competitors, feeding them inside information about upcoming contracts and strategic plans. She'd convinced Margaret to spy on board meetings and report back every detail. But the most devastating discovery was a series of email exchanges between Sarah and Eleanor's lawyer. In them, Sarah had provided detailed information about her father's health, his stress levels, his increasingly isolated position within his own company. "He's showing signs of clinical depression," Sarah had written. "Mom thinks we could make a case for diminished capacity if we need to. He's been making erratic decisions lately, easy to paint as mentally unfit." They'd been planning to have him declared incompetent. They'd researched conservatorship laws, consulted with psychiatrists who would testify to his declining mental state, prepared to strip him of everything, including his basic human dignity. The cruelest part? They'd planned to use his love for them as evidence of his instability. His excessive generosity and refusal to protect family assets shows he's not thinking clearly, Eleanor's lawyer had advised. That night, Richard had called Blackwood and moved everything offshore. Every last penny. For the first time since childhood, Sarah looked genuinely vulnerable. Her carefully styled hair had come undone, and tears threatened to spill from her eyes as she approached her father's chair. "Daddy," she said, using the name she hadn't spoken in years. "Please, we can work this out. I know things have been difficult between us, but this doesn't have to be the end." Her voice cracked with emotion that seemed genuine for the first time all evening. "I made mistakes. We all did. But this cutting us out completely, this isn't you. The father I knew was forgiving. He was kind." Eleanor hissed something under her breath, but Margaret shot her a warning look. They needed Sarah to succeed where anger had failed. "Remember when I was little?" Sarah continued, kneeling beside Richard's chair. "Remember how you used to read me stories every night? How you promised you'd always be there for me? I know I haven't been the daughter you deserved, but couldn't we try again?" The room held its breath. Even the lawyer seemed affected by the raw emotion in her voice. Richard looked down at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in months. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away, and he could see the little girl who'd once trusted him with her whole heart. But then he noticed something that chilled him. Sarah's eyes kept flicking toward Eleanor, seeking approval, even in this moment of supposed vulnerability. Even now, even begging for forgiveness, she was performing for someone else's benefit. Richard stood slowly, his movement commanding attention in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. For months, he'd felt invisible in this house, dismissed and irrelevant. But now, with the truth finally exposed, he felt his strength returning. "You're right about one thing, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that none of them had heard in years. "I did promise to always be there for you, and I was." He walked around the table, his eyes meeting each family member in turn. "I was there when you needed college tuition. I was there when you wanted the wedding of your dreams. I was there when you needed startup money for business ventures that never panned out." His voice grew stronger with each word. "I was there through every crisis, every emergency, every time any of you needed something that money could solve." He stopped behind Eleanor's chair. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as a person. I became a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed." Margaret started to protest, but he held up his hand. "You said I had nothing left to offer because I already gave everything, to people who only saw me as a wallet." His eyes found Sarah's. "The father who read you bedtime stories? The man who worked 16-hour days to give you everything? He disappeared the moment you decided his love wasn't worth as much as Eleanor's money." The room was absolutely silent. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat diplomatically. "There is, however, one additional provision in Mr. Harrison's will that I haven't yet addressed. Every head in the room snapped toward him with desperate hope. Eleanor gripped her chair arms so tightly her knuckles went white. The property known as 1247 Maple Street, Mr. Harrison's childhood home, which he purchased and restored 5 years ago, has been placed in a special trust. Richard's eyes softened slightly. The little blue house where he'd grown up, where his parents had taught him about integrity and hard work, where he dreamed of building something meaningful with his life. This property, Blackwood continued, along with a maintenance fund of $500,000, has been designated for Mr. Harrison's first grandchild. Sarah gasped, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. She wasn't pregnant, but the message was clear. Any child of hers would inherit something, but not from her directly. The trust specifically states that ownership will transfer to any grandchild when they reach age 25, but only if they demonstrate strong moral character and have not been influenced by certain named family members in their upbringing. Eleanor's face twisted with rage. What does that mean? Which family members? Blackwood consulted his notes. The trust specifically excludes influence from Eleanor Whitman, Margaret Harrison, and any associates or relatives who participated in the systematic undermining of Mr. Harrison's business and personal relationships. Sarah sank into a chair, the full implications washing over her. Her father was offering hope to the next generation while ensuring the current one couldn't corrupt it. Eleanor erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for years. She struggled to her feet, her aged frame shaking with fury, and swept her arm across the dining table, sending crystal glasses and china crashing to the floor. 40 years! She screamed, spittle flying from her lips. 40 years I've watched my daughter waste her life on you. 40 years of your mediocrity, your failures, your pathetic attempts to be somebody important. She advanced on Richard, jabbing her finger at his chest. You think this makes you clever? You think hiding money makes you powerful? You're nothing but a vindictive old man who can't accept that better people outmaneuvered you. Her voice rose to a shriek. I'll destroy you. I'll hire the best lawyers money can buy. I'll prove you're mentally incompetent. I'll show the world what a fraud you really are. Margaret jumped up, torn between supporting her mother and the dawning realization that attacking Richard further might make everything worse. Mother, please. Don't please me. Eleanor whirled on her daughter. Look what your husband has done. Look how he's humiliated this family. We'll be laughingstocks. She turned back to Richard, her eyes blazing with decades of accumulated hatred. You want a war? You'll get one. I'll make sure you don't see a penny of that money while you're alive to enjoy it. With that, she stormed toward the door, her cane striking the marble floor like thunder. Come on, Margaret. We're not staying to watch this farce. Margaret hesitated, looking between her mother and her husband, before reluctantly following Eleanor out. After the echo of Eleanor's exit faded, the dining room felt cavernously empty. Uncle Thomas and the other relatives had quickly made their excuses and fled, unwilling to be associated with the family's public meltdown. Only Sarah remained, slumped in her chair like a puppet with cut strings. For the first time in years, she looked her age, young, lost, and utterly alone. Mr. Blackwood quietly gathered his papers, giving father and daughter privacy for what both sensed might be their last real conversation. Sarah's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Richard studied his daughter's face, searching for the real question behind her words. Why didn't you tell me about the money? Why didn't you tell me you knew about our plans? Why didn't you tell me you still loved me enough to leave something for my children? Which part? He asked gently. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Any of it. All of it. I thought you really had lost everything. I thought we were protecting ourselves from a sinking ship. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. When did you know? About what we were planning? Richard sat down across from her, suddenly feeling every one of his 62 years. I've known for almost 3 years, Sarah. The emails, the meetings, the legal consultations about having me declared incompetent. I knew all of it. Sarah's face crumpled. Then why didn't you stop us? Why didn't you fight back? Because I wanted to see how far you'd go. he said simply. I needed to know if there was anything left of the daughter I raised. 25 years earlier, asterisk. Richard carried 4-year-old Sarah on his shoulders through the park, her delighted squeals echoing across the playground. Margaret was at another of her mother's charity events, leaving father and daughter to their Saturday adventure. Higher, Daddy? Sarah giggled, tugging on his hair. Any higher and you'll need oxygen. Richard laughed, but he stood on his tiptoes anyway, making airplane noises as he swooped her around. Those were the golden years, before Eleanor's influence poisoned everything. Richard had worked 2 jobs then, his day position at a small engineering firm and weekend consulting work, saving every penny for Sarah's future, while Margaret complained about their modest apartment. I want to be just like you when I grow up, Sarah had announced one evening, helping him balance his checkbook at the kitchen table. What, old and tired? Richard had teased. No, silly. Smart and kind and strong. She'd climbed onto his lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. I want to help people like you do. He'd held her close that night, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, making silent promises about the life he'd build for her. He dreamed of watching her graduate, walking her down the aisle, teaching his grandchildren the values his own father had passed down. What he'd never imagined was sitting across from that same little girl 25 years later, watching her cry over the inheritance she'd lost by choosing greed over love. Sarah's composure finally shattered completely. Years of buried guilt, suppressed love, and twisted family loyalty poured out in heaving sobs that shook her entire body. I'm so sorry, she gasped between tears. God, Daddy, I'm so sorry. She convinced me. They convinced me that you were weak, that you were dragging us all down. They said I had to choose between a future and the past. She buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled and broken. I believed them. I believed that love was just sentiment. That family was about survival, not loyalty. They taught me to see you as a liability instead of remembering that you were my hero. Richard watched his daughter fall apart, and for a moment, every paternal instinct screamed at him to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, to forgive and forget like he'd done so many times before. But the wound was too deep now, carved out by years of calculated betrayal. Even as his heart broke watching her pain, he couldn't bring himself to move from his chair. When did you stop seeing me as your father? He asked quietly. Sarah looked up, her mascara streaked down her cheeks. I don't know. It happened so gradually. Grandmother would make little comments about your business decisions. Mom would sigh about money problems. They'd praise me for being more practical than you, more realistic about family dynamics. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, looking young and lost. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already in too deep. I'd already said things, done things. I thought it was too late to come back. Richard stood slowly, his decision crystallizing in the weight of the moment. He looked down at his daughter, still crying, still broken, still young enough to change if she chose to, and felt a complex mixture of love and loss. Forgiveness isn't something I can just give you, Sarah, he said quietly. It's something you have to earn back, choice by choice, day by day. He moved toward the door, each step feeling both necessary and heartbreaking. The trust for your children stands. They'll have opportunities you threw away. What they do with those opportunities will be up to them, and how you raise them. Sarah looked up sharply. Where are you going? To live the life I should have been living all along. Richard paused at the doorway without turning back. To work with people who value integrity over inheritance, who measure success by what they build rather than what they can take. Behind him, he could hear Sarah's chair scrape against the floor as she stood. Daddy, please, can't we try to? You know where to find me if you ever become the woman I raised you to be, Richard said simply. Until then, take care of yourself, Sarah. He walked out of the mansion, Eleanor's mansion, he reminded himself, without looking back. The late afternoon sun felt warm on his face as he reached his car, and for the first time in years, Richard Harrison felt free. The weight of carrying a family that had long since stopped caring about him lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the lightness of possibility. Within a week, news of Richard's financial revelations had spread through their social circles like wildfire. The story was too delicious to contain. The failed businessman who'd outmaneuvered some of the city's most sophisticated manipulators. His old business associates, who'd distanced themselves during his supposed downfall, suddenly returned his calls with enthusiasm. James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Technologies, invited him to lunch and offered him a consulting position on the spot. "I always knew there was more to your story," Morrison said over expensive wine. "A man doesn't build what you built without having contingency plans." Meanwhile, Eleanor's once formidable social network began to crack. Her friends, who'd enjoyed gossiping about Richard's failures, now whispered about her desperation and Margaret's public humiliation. Charity boards quietly questioned whether the Whitman family donations would continue at previous levels. The most satisfying vindication came from Dr. Peterson, the family physician who'd been quietly documenting Eleanor's requests for medical opinions about Richard's mental state. When the truth emerged, Peterson made it clear that he'd never found any evidence of cognitive decline. Quite the opposite. Mr. Harrison's strategic thinking appears to be as sharp as ever, Peterson noted dryly when questioned by Eleanor's lawyers. Richard watched the social realignment with detached interest, focusing instead on the scholarship foundation that would become his true legacy. 3 weeks after the catastrophic family meeting, Sarah appeared in Richard's downtown office. She'd called ahead, a small courtesy that surprised him, and waited patiently in the reception area despite having the connections to demand immediate access. She looked different, younger somehow but also more serious. Her expensive designer clothes had been replaced with a simple business suit, and she wore minimal makeup that couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. "Thank you for seeing me," she said formally as she entered his temporary office space. Richard gestured to a chair across from his desk, maintaining professional distance. "You said it was important. I've been thinking about what you said, about earning forgiveness." Sarah sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap. "I've left the family trust, declined Eleanor's money. I know that doesn't undo anything, but I wanted you to know that I'm choosing differently now." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. "I also wanted to give you this. It's a letter I wrote to you 3 years ago, right after the company failed. I never sent it because Eleanor convinced me it would just make things worse." Richard took the letter but didn't open it immediately. "What does it say?" "That I was proud of you for building something from nothing. That I understood why you fought so hard to save it. That I loved you regardless of what happened with the business." Sarah's voice caught slightly. "That I was sorry for not standing by you when you needed me most." Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. "Words are a start, Sarah," he said finally. "But forgiveness isn't words. It's change." 6 months later, Richard stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom in the Morrison Hotel, surrounded by cameras and an audience of young entrepreneurs who'd received the first Harrison Foundation scholarships. The foundation had funded 30 full-ride scholarships for students who'd demonstrated resilience in the face of family or financial betrayal. Each recipient had a story of rebuilding from nothing, of choosing integrity over easy money, of believing in themselves when others had given up on them. "They said I had nothing left to offer," Richard began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed ballroom. "And in a way they were right. I had nothing left to offer people who saw me only as a resource to be exploited." He gestured toward the scholarship recipients seated in the front rows. "But I discovered I had everything to offer people who understood the value of earning what they receive." In the back of the room, unnoticed by the cameras, Sarah sat quietly beside her husband, a social worker she'd met while volunteering at a homeless shelter. She was 6 months pregnant, glowing with the peace that comes from finally making choices based on love rather than fear. She caught her father's eye for just a moment during his speech. He nodded slightly, not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. "Progress. Today," Richard concluded, his voice strong and clear, "I offer hope to those who still believe that success is measured not by what you can take, but by what you can build. Not by who you can control, but by who you can inspire. As cameras flashed and applause thundered through the ballroom, Richard Harrison smiled with the deep satisfaction of a man who discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what's truly worth keeping. The future finally looked bright.